whatever project you are doing calls for you to do watercolors. I like watercolors, kind of. They can have a tendency to be a little messy and get out of control. But for the most part, they're really nice, especially when used in tandem with other things like oil pastels. Oil pastels made of oil and the watercolors made of water, they repel each other, so they work really nice with each other. Be careful if you use markers, just regular markers with these. Most regular markers are washable.
Attention special education staff, the department meeting for this morning has been canceled. There is no special ed team department meeting this morning. Thank you.
If you use them in tandem with the watercolors and the Cray-Pods, it looks really nice. Be careful if you're using them with regular markers, because the regular markers will wash out and they'll become very water and you'll lose your color. So just keep that in mind. Don't use these with regular markers. So there's a couple things you're going to need to get started. You will need your paper. It needs to be a thicker paper, not thin drawing paper. You're going to need tape. You're going to need a brush. Don't make it too thin. A lot of people like to use really thin brushes with watercolors. Don't do that. You're going to need a water dish, and then obviously there's two places you can get watercolors. The first is inside one of these. Everybody's automatically looking for the perfect one. A lot of these have been used a bunch of times. There's not one that's perfect. A lot of times, this one's actually probably been replaced recently because the two that are usually gone are the blue and the green. And then there is other watercolors you can use. This is liquid watercolors. Just be very careful with this. This will stain your clothes permanently. So when you're using this one, make sure you try and use the aprons. Okay, so I'll just pour a little bit of this in here so you can show you. You would just need a cup for this. And you just pour a little bit in there. And that's all you really need for it. Okay, so here it is. Let's start working. Oh, I'm sorry, you will also need a paper towel just to wash off your brush. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you how to use the watercolors. The number one thing people do wrong is they scrape out the watercolors. They think watercolors are supposed to be super thick and dark. That is way beyond wrong. When you're doing watercolors, you want to make sure they're light, they are watery, but you got to try and find this good mix between too much water and not enough water, because too much water, it's going to just smear all over the place. You can't, like I said, you need to use a thicker paper. I'm right here using tag board because I was going to draw on it, but you can also use watercolor paper. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to tape down the edges of my project with tape. The reason I am doing that is the paper's going to kind of bulge a little bit. It naturally does that. You're just getting the paper fibers wet again, and they'll eventually start to flatten out a little bit, but they're always going to have a little bit of a bulge to them. It's just the way it works. That's why you need to have a little bit thicker of a paper. Do not come to me and freak out. I understand the way watercolors work. It's okay. It's supposed to happen that way. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm just going to also draw down here a little bit with this oil pastels. So I'm going to take my water here. Here's my dish. All right, now I'm going to just take some colors here. Let's use a little bit of red. I want the red, again, it's going to be watery. So I'm just going to come in here, and I want to try as much as possible to keep my brush strokes going in the same direction. Don't start going all over the place. It tends to look really messy. And if you notice, I'm going right over that oil pastel, and it's not smearing or anything. It's just staying totally fine. Now, you can obviously make it a little bit darker just by adding a little bit less water. So that is something you can do. You can kind of fade it. Make it dark down here and then fade it up. That's one of the things you can do. You can also fade other colors. When you do that, you want to make sure whenever you're switching colors to wash out your brush a lot. you'll find sometimes that these have like different colors inside of them, and that's because people, there's many reasons why that happens, but the main reason is people just didn't wash out their brush before they put in the other one. So always wash off your brush whenever you're changing colors. So I'm going to come in here, maybe I'll use a little bit of blue. A little bit more red here. You don't get it quick enough when you're trying to mix. You get these lines on it. But you can mix colors here. Notice I'm washing out my brush every single time. And you can kind of mix colors. Let's add a little bit of green to it. Here. There you go. Now I'll just show you real quick how the regular liquid watercolors work. That one you just don't need as much water. You can see they're a little bit more rich. Some people prefer these better. You can use this one. It's totally fine. You don't need as much water because they're already kind of watered down for you. So, notice all these I tried to keep my brush strokes going back and forth. Alright, so that's watercolors. Make sure you're washing out your brushes. Don't mix the colors back and forth here. There are liquid ones you want to use, and if you want to use it in tandem with Crayons, that's fine. Notice here, if I push down on this, this is starting to bulge. That's natural. It's supposed to happen that way. Once you've gotten done with your watercolors, now it's time to clean up. You've got a bunch of things that you're going to have to clean up. The first thing is give me back my tape. Don't just let it sit around. Please put it back at my desk. If you used any oil pastels, make sure that they find themselves back either into the big bin here or into the smaller little containers that I have out. The next thing you're going to have to do is put away the watercolors. Now, the watercolors right here, there's still water in there. They've pooled, it's pooling inside there. A lot of times if you look at these, they're splatter all over the place. That's from people taking these and throwing them like this into the watercolor container. Don't do that, because when you do that, all the water inside there splashes all over the place and gets inside of the other colors. I'd like you to please take these, place them in here. If you used any liquid watercolors and you put it in a cup, make sure you throw it in the garbage can. The next thing you have to do, wash this out. Just dump the water in there. Wash out your brush. It should be very easy. And then I kind of just squeeze it out with my finger. And then I put that into the brush container. So brush container's done. Watercolors put back. Dish, just put it up here on the countertop. Crayons put away. Now your project, the only last thing you'll have to do is put that probably on a drying rack. Unless it's really dry, then you can still put it in your bin. But just keep track of it. Make sure your name's on it in case it gets lost. So that's it. You guys are ready for watercolors.